Let's begin.
Glad that the curse of Locust Lake is gone. This is such a good camp. So peaceful now.
I just want to tell you about this time at Locust Lake that I never told you about.
Wait, I thought the curse was over.
Well, it is, but this happened after the curse got brought back and before the cult of locusts. Just listen to this Halloween story.
Okay, please, just don't kill me.
Well, I call this one Trick or Retreat, a Halloween at Locust Lake. A small band of what could have been described as friends sat beside each other within the warm embrace of a bright, crackling fire. The night was Halloween night, and the place was that of Audrey's choosing, the closed grounds of Forest Trails State Park, a place that most residents of nearby townships still call Locust Lake. An old sign just inside the tree line, obscured by underbrush and years of weathered neglect, read, "Just a gosh darn camp," underscoring to all that may remember the once flourishing campground that this was indeed the spot. The place where an untold number of hikers and campers alike either lost their lives or went missing, never to be seen again. Some of the older folk in town claim that these lands are haunted or cursed, and Audrey knew that they were right. She could feel it, sense it, every time she came here, which was pretty often this past summer. Audrey believed that she was psychic, able to sense and or describe past experiences of certain objects, locations, and people. This in turn made her somewhat of a laughingstock within her social circle, or the butt end of many jokes, to say the least. But this was something she wished that she could get used to, but never truly did. Audrey felt that what she believed was her gift was actually, in fact, a curse, the source of her basically being an outcast among her own people. Still, she was determined to have a great Halloween. It was her favorite holiday, and this year would be one to remember. "So what's the deal with this place?" A young man spoke up from the other side of Audrey's boyfriend, Peter. His name was Francis, but everyone called him Frank. Peter finished a long pull off of his can of beer before belching and replying to Frank's comment.
Something about ghosts haunting the land and spiriting people away. Or something like that,
he said, not having much clue as to what he was talking about.
No, it's more than that. You seriously don't know the legends?
Audrey asked, eyeing the three faces lit by flickering illumination. Frank began to laugh out loud, being joined soon after by Andy, short for Andrea, his girlfriend, and Audrey's best friend. The four of them had been drinking since they arrived, but Francis had been indulging more than the rest, so the atypical snide, pompous behavior was of no surprise to Audrey. This excursion was just a joke to him, and Andy both. The thought of indulging in supernatural fantasies and unsubstantiated fear created by rednecks with no education was just as ludicrous to Peter, but he was here in hopes of getting laid, and did his best not to let on.
What legends? You mean the one about that Casper guy?
Andy interjected. Casper? I thought it was some zombie dude or something named Jacob. He was drowned at the orphanage or something, right? Francis responded.
Wait a minute. You guys are getting it all mixed up. I can't believe this place is practically in your backyards. And you guys don't even know the myths surrounding it?
Audrey stated with authority. Frank and Andy eyed each other and giggled to themselves, finding Audrey's seriousness at such an implausible ghost story good for a chuckle. Peter was busy playing with his phone. Audrey eyed it with disgust, and when Peter looked up at her, she did her best to remove the expression from her face, but he caught it. Peter knew that if he were to have any luck for the night, that he would have to put away the phone, for the memories it surely brought to the surface of Audrey's mind would facilitate a cock-block too immovable to overcome. Those memories were surely still fresh in her mind. He truly was sorry. But that wouldn't matter, just like the fact that it happened over 2 months ago didn't matter. It was a sore subject matter to Audrey, and Peter contemplated these thoughts even as Audrey began deliberating her tale to the others by the dancing flames of a warm, popping and spitting bonfire.
The lands, these mountains, the surrounding woods, they're all haunted. Deny it if you want. But there's more than enough evidence related to the homicides and disappearances to support the idea. And I know you don't believe me. None of you. But I can feel it. This place speaks to me. Tells me things I really shouldn't know.
The group chuckled a bit to themselves, at Audrey's expense, of course.
Laugh all you want. But that Casper guy, Casper Stoical, actually, he burned down an orphanage full of children, right over there. And that's a fact.
At this, the group fell somewhat silent and turned their heads to look in the direction of Aubrey's finger, now pointed. Audrey told them that another boy named Jacob Treagle also disappeared here a few decades beforehand, and that no one knew what happened to him. She said that she agreed when she told them that some people in town still say that Jacob roams the area, ready to kill anyone who dares enter his domain somewhere in the woods around them. Locals tell people that you shouldn't even speak his name.
Who? Jacob Treagle?
Frank said mockingly before bursting out into laughter.
Laugh it up, meat sack. Because out here in these woods, that's all you are. Dead meat.
Audrey pointed in the direction of a dark tree line a few feet away at seemingly nothing, but the group knew what resided there, hidden by the dark of night. It was an old, burned-down cabin.
Those kids laugh too, I'm sure, sloughing off the warnings of those who have lived here their whole lives. And you know what? They were burned alive too. Murdered alongside everyone that was at the camp that year. Everyone except one little girl who managed to escape. And a groundskeeper left for dead. That's why they closed this old camp, you know? The silence here is deceiving. Sure, most of the people come and go here without issue. No supernatural ghosts of the woods to speak of. But every now and then, the murders just start up. There's so many accounts of missing campers and unexplained bloodbaths that you have to be blind to simply ignore them all.
The group was dead quiet here, conveying they indeed, at some level, believed in the curse of Locust Lake.
If you talk to descendants of the Native Americans that inhabited these woods, they will tell you their people left these lands because they felt the soil and lake itself had become tainted with a deadly curse. We're the first to return here in a while. Except for myself, of course.
What do you mean by that?
Andy asked her.
I come here a lot. It's peaceful as I'm always alone here. It's a great place to come and think. If you can avoid being slaughtered, that is.
Audrey answered.
You never told me that.
Peter interjected.
I do have some secrets of my own, you know.
Peter thought about arguing against the fact of keeping secrets from one another, but he knew he didn't have a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of, metaphorically speaking. And while he was wrestling with these thoughts, Francis chimed in. You can't come here. This place is closed, and the gates are regularly checked by the local police.
I don't use the gate. My house borders on the property line on the east end. I simply walk through the woods. In fact, that stream over there is the same one that runs through the woods behind my house.
Oh, well, I guess that makes a lot of sense, Frank responded, somewhat meekly after being put in his place.
Well, thanks for hiking us in here, I guess. I have to admit, I was a little apprehensive. I'm not a big fan of the woods or camping, but this was kind of fun.
Andy added before taking another swig of the bottle of liquor. Peter, still silent, thinking to himself, put his hand out for the bottle, and Andy handed it to him before rubbing at both of her shoulders and arms with her hands.
I'm starting to get cold, though,
Andy added. Peter stared down at the fire, bottle in hand.
Flames are getting low. I'm working on a bed of coals here, Frank. What say you to going for a run to get some more wood?
Peter asked. Why me? Frank asked, but was sharply replied to by Andy when she slapped his arm. It was obvious that Peter wanted some alone time with Audrey.
Come on, I'll go with you. I'll make it a fun trip,
Andy assured him with a wanting, drunken wink. Francis grinned wildly. Yup, looks like I'm off to get wood, or firewood. Yeah, be back in a minute, guys, Frank said, standing to his feet and pulling Andy up beside him by the hand.
I bet you will only be a minute,
Peter jibed him. Both Andy and Peter laughed. Frank simply told them to shut up, but Audrey said nothing, not really reacting at all, only clutching the strap of her backpack tightly in her hand. She, too, had a lot coursing through her thoughts. The forest was eerily silent. No crickets or peeping frogs, and given the context of the area, the woods should have been a bustle with nocturnal life. Unfortunately, Andy and Francis had consumed such a large amount of alcohol that neither noticed the ominous silence of the night. Their minds were preoccupied with other intentions, contrasting that of collecting firewood.
You want me to do it right here, on the ground?
Andy asked Frank, looking down at the accumulation of browned leaves and dry twigs. We can lay down on our clothes, Frank suggested, starting to undress.
You're so romantic,
Andy said with detectable sarcasm. Let's be serious, babe. You're not with me for the romance, he argued, while simultaneously alluding to his manhood.
No arguments here.
Andy giggled as she began to take off her top, pulling it up over her head, exposing her green, lacy bra. This is when a masked killer, hiding himself in the nearby darkness of the forest, made his move, already having silently moved into position merely feet away from the two of them, stationing himself behind Andy. Francis never even saw the rusty, toothed blade of the pole-saw fly through the darkness like a throwing knife before becoming lodged deep into his face, destroying his right ocular socket and forcing the bridge of his nose to the left. Andy heard a crunch and a gurgle and felt the sharp splatter of warm fluid across her concealed face, begging her to swiftly remove the shirt from off her eyes. For a moment, one eye had gained sight of Frank on the forest floor before her, choking his last gurgled breath before falling limp at her feet, topless and running red from his face with blood. But as soon as she had gained sight of this gruesome scene, the shirt was yanked back down over her face with such force that it turned her sudden shrill shriek into a muffled cry of panicked despair. Reaching up with her hands, fighting to free her head from the shirt and Jacob's grasp, Andy quickly lost her balance and fell backward as Jacob tugged. She was being dragged, her head ensnared in her shirt, heels dragging through the leaves and sticks beneath the darkest of canopies, and she was unable to do anything about it. She felt hopelessness and helplessness all at once. She didn't want to, but she knew she couldn't avoid her inevitable fate. She was doomed to die in these cursed woods. Had she known that she was being dragged towards Jacob's hidden implement of interest, a bear trap, she may have fought a little harder, but futilely nonetheless. Andy's muffled shrieks crescendoed, reaching its climax just before Jacob gripped her head with both hands, turned her face around, and slammed her face down onto the metal jaws at his boots. Andy's cries turned into gurgled gasps for a moment before ceasing entirely. Jacob watched as the body spasmed and twitched at his feet. The evil grin carved into the wooden mask almost seemed fitting as the predator looked on. But his admiration and curiosity ended abruptly with one swift rise and fall of his large right boot, connecting with the back of Andy's skull and crushing what remained of her face deeper into the trap. The teeth dug into her cranium, nearly cracking it wide open like a large egg as the teeth clenched shut beneath Jacob's foot.
Come on, Audrey. Why can't we just get past this?
Back at camp, Peter and Audrey were having a bit of a lover's quarrel.
Get past it? How can I ever show my face in school with pride ever again? The last 2 months have been hell for me.
Audrey was livid.
Oh, come on. It was just a joke.
The things I did for you were a joke? Me giving you a blowjob was a joke?
She had him on the ropes now.
No, that's not what I meant.
Peter started, but was quickly interrupted.
Oh, so me giving you head isn't a joke, but taking a picture of it with your phone and texting the entire school, that's the joke, right? Oh, now I get it. Oh wait, no, it's still dark here.
That wasn't me. I just sent it to Frank. Him and Andy are the ones who shared it all over school.
You know what? I'm done with this conversation.
Audrey said, completely fed up before standing to her feet and readying herself to walk off, away from Peter. But Peter, as drunk as he was quick on his reflexes and stood to grab Audrey to keep her from leaving, getting a hold of her backpack. Audrey tugged, trying to shake his hand off, but Peter had a strong grip and only succeeded in opening the zipper a few inches, enough to catch sight of what was inside. The most curious thing about it was that he shouldn't have been able to. It was far too dark to see anything of detail without a light source, but the object he spied seemed to stand out as an almost brilliant yellowish white, not quite glowing, but like it was spray-painted in that cheap glow-in-the-dark aerosol paint, left nearly unchanged. It was slender but bulbous at one end and half concealed. Peter knew what it was. He'd grown up in the woods of the mountains as well, and had seen his fair share of animal skeletons. This was, without a doubt, a bone, but far too large to be that of a rabbit or squirrel.
What the fuck is that thing?
Peter demanded, letting go.
Just get the fuck away from me.
Audrey replied, taking the opportunity to get away from him. She didn't want to explain anything. It was all over now anyway. Besides, even if she told them the truth, they wouldn't believe her. They would all just laugh at her expense, and it was too late for them anyway. Hell, Frank and Andy were likely dead by now, Audrey pondered internally. And as she did, Audrey thought back to a time this summer, when she had crossed the back boundary and wandered down the forest trails towards the lake, at the shores of what used to be just a gosh darn camp. On this day, Audrey took a side trail that would bring her a slightly longer way, letting her enjoy the journey beneath the tall maples and evergreens just a little bit longer. She wasn't too far into the forest before the canopy became thick, blockading almost all of the sunshine above its enveloping leaves, and even the bark on the trees in this area of the forest seemed darker than those that grew along the mountainside. In fact, they seemed nearly black. She'd always been sensitive to the history of things. Retrocognition. That's what Google labeled it as when she had searched to place a name to the thing that made her so different from everyone else. Audrey had a way of knowing the past, things and people from times gone by, calling out to her, leading her to some unknown end. This particular day, back before school had started for the year, the ethereal callings of Locust Lake nudged at her thoughts, pushed at her behavior in a way that she could not explain, even to herself, but leading her towards an old, fallen tree deep in the blackest part of the forest. The trunk was long and thick around, and snapped off at the base. Audrey didn't know how, but she knew that there was something inside the stump's decaying core. Peering over the splintered and rotting top, she found the center to be hollow. Pushing the organic rubbish aside, Audrey dug her small hand down into wood rot and soil, clawing at the ground inside like an animal, until she gripped something smooth between her fingers. Pulling it free, she pondered at it for a moment until finally realizing what it was. It was a bone, and the energy coming from it told her that somehow the thing was sacred. Audrey eyed it close, examining every detail, when suddenly she heard a snap behind her. She quickly turned to face the direction of the noise, and she almost dropped the object in her hands to the ground, at her feet in shock. Later, thankful that she didn't. Before her, only a couple of dozen inches away from where she had been crouched, stood a tall, looming silhouette of a man. He was garbed in all black, tattered clothing. A thin hood rose up out of the collar of his long coat, covering his head and framing the bloated and rotten wooden mask that it wore on its face. The sinister grin carved into its expression made him appear all that much more frightening, as if grinning at the bloodshed that would soon follow. But it didn't follow. Audrey was sure that the man would reach out and grab her at any moment, only to tear her apart piece by piece, or maybe something worse. But instead, the thing just stood there, almost as if waiting, or unable to approach any closer. And as with all things, Audrey just knew. She knew in that moment that this thing could not harm her, that the rumors regarding Locust Lake were true, that they were all true. And yet, as long as she possessed this sacred object, she would be exempt from ensuing slaughter. Backing away slowly, Audrey made for home. She was positive that the thing in the woods would follow her, but to her relief, it didn't. Clutching the smooth bone in her hand, refusing to let it go until safely beyond the borders of the land surrounding the lake, Audrey escaped with her life that day. It was then that Audrey was brought abruptly from her thoughts and back into her present surroundings, deep in the woods, surrounding Locust Lake, on Halloween night.
Hey! Come on, Audrey! Wait up!
Peter yelled as he came clambering out of the bushes after her. Audrey turned in Peter's direction, seeing him chasing after her. This was it, and she knew it. She stopped and waited for him to approach her.
Babe, come on. Let's talk.
Peter started, gasping for air.
You know I love you. I made a mistake. Can't we just get past this?
Audrey said nothing, just stared right at him, through him, watching her sinister plan unfold.
Okay, you're not saying anything. At least I got you to listen to me.
Peter stopped talking for a moment, realizing that whatever Audrey was looking at, it wasn't him. He was just about to turn around and look behind himself when he heard the sound of a twig breaking in that direction, and it sounded close. The last glimpse Peter got of Audrey was her face, a sinister grin in her expression, not all that dissimilar to the one on the wooden mask that Peter now stared directly into once turning to face behind him. Audrey smiled, even chuckled a bit to herself as she watched the monster of Locust Lake grab a hold of Peter's head with one hand and right arm with the other. She didn't even turn away when the appendage was ripped from its socket with a sickening, soft, wet pop. Peter cried out in agony for Audrey's help, but things were unfolding just the way that she had hoped. She knew that this beast would render her vengeance for her, that she wouldn't have to lift a hand to dirty it, and that she would be absolved as long as she possessed her treasure. What she didn't expect was for Jacob to lift Peter with both hands, flip him over sideways, and break his spine over his knee before hurling Peter in Audrey's direction. His body swung limply through the air, as if his legs belonged to a marionette. It happened so suddenly that Audrey had no time to react. The momentum of Peter's large body was enough to throw Audrey to the forest floor, his mass laying heavily on top of her. Jacob approached his prey, and Audrey struggled to roll the heavy body of her boyfriend off of her, realizing that he was still clinging to the last moments of life when he released a short wheeze from his throat. Jacob towered over Audrey now, his form black and silhouetted against the moonlight that peeked sparsely through the dense canopy above. Audrey dug deep within herself, and with a final shove, managed to push Peter aside. Making sure she grabbed the backpack tightly, Audrey ran off into the surrounding forest in no particular direction, leaving the dark form behind her, watching on silently as she disappeared into the dark collage of brush and tree trunks on a moonlit Halloween night. She had won. Audrey giggled. She laughed. It actually worked. They were dead, and her vengeance had been satisfied. Most would have suffered regret at post-homicidal actions, but not Audrey. She was always a little twisted, a little off. That's what they said, right? She pondered over her victory, the Halloween that she would never forget, and before long, she'd found her way back to the shores of Locust Lake. From here, she would simply hop the gate at the front entrance. Any police that might greet her would take her for a would-be victim of yet another massacre at the lake, another massacre that claimed the lives of her friends. Prosecution of trespassing would be unlikely at that point. She began walking past the old campground and down the gravel path that led to an old dirt road, but stopped upon seeing 3 figures in the dark, approaching her from the direction of which she headed.
Hello?
She called out to them. No response. The trio of ominous, dark shapes sauntered ever forward, and as they did, Audrey began to slowly take in details. One was tall, bulky, and wore some sort of black hood over his face. The other 2 were most certainly female, though one wore nothing except for small patches of mud-soaked animal hides and furs, and the other in a ratty business suit-like attire, as if she'd been buried in an age past and was newly resurrected from her grave. Audrey reeled at the sight. It couldn't be, she thought. She quickly threw the pack from her shoulders and spun it around in front of her. Her face went pale as her breath was practically stolen from her lungs. She hadn't realized it, but when Jacob tossed Peter at her, forcing her to the ground, the bone in her backpack had slipped out through the opening that Peter had created when he first grabbed her back at the campsite. She turned to run back through the woods and straight to her house, but it was too late. The last thing she would lay her eyes upon would be Jacob's splintered wooden mask. Jacob made quick work of his prey, and she was added to the body count in seconds, eviscerated from pelvis to sternum. And as Audrey grasped at her bowels that now spilled forth from the gaping wound, she collapsed to the ground. She knew that they had retrieved it. Fading into dark oblivion, Audrey knew that this time it would never be found again.
I want to thank you all for tuning in for tonight's Halloween special. I sure hope you liked it more than my little friend did here. But then again, if you did survive the night, don't forget to tune in next year for another Halloween blowout extravaganza. And until then, remember, always enjoy a good story.